The air inside the fifth-floor control hub smelled faintly of stale espresso and dry carpet fiber, a climate I personally maintained at a rigid 68 degrees by manually balancing the dampers in the air handling units. Watching the nervous beads of sweat gather on Julian's forehead, however, anyone would have assumed the room was sweltering under an absolute heatwave. Julian, the recently appointed director of corporate optimization, stood at the head of the polished oak table, practically vibrating with the reckless energy of unearned privilege and corporate arrogance. I was standing unobtrusively near the back glass panel checking power distribution loads on my industrial tablet when his sharp voice cut through the hum of the servers like a cracking whip. "Refill the heavy-duty plotter, assistant," Julian barked without bothering to turn around, blindly waving a hand at an incomprehensible pie chart displayed on the main monitor. "And fetch me imported sparkling water right now, not the municipal sludge from the break room tap." The entire room plunged into a suffocating silence, the precise kind of quiet that precedes a catastrophic pressure valve blowout in a high-pressure steam line. Surrounding the perimeter, the senior project managers shifted uncomfortably in their mesh ergonomic chairs, keeping their eyes glued to their lapids to avoid becoming collateral damage. They were well aware that I wasn't anyone's administrative assistant, but rather Evelyn, the master systems engineer who held every access code, master security override, and structural schematic for the entire complex. Julian, however, was a lateral transfer from the Dallas division, who mistakenly believed that high-rise infrastructure managed itself through sheer corporate goodwill and blind luck. When I didn't immediately scurry away to execute his petty demands, he spun around with a manic intensity burning in his eyes, his $300 haircut bristling with indignation. "Did you lose your hearing?" he sneered, crossing his arms over a tailored designer suit. "We have the European Investment Board joining us via secure video link in 15 minutes. And this diagnostic rendering looks like an absolute mess." I glanced down at the heavy brass ID badge clipped securely to my utility belt, right alongside my high-voltage multi-tool and master key card. The card explicitly read Evelyn, Principal Systems Engineer, but to a man like Julian, any woman over 40 not wearing a silk blouse was simply disposable labor. "The network printer isn't out of ink, Julian," I replied evenly, my voice remaining entirely flat as I met his aggressive stare. "You're attempting to force an unformatted architectural file through a standard thermal spooler, which is a fundamental user error on your part." His eyes blinked rapidly as his fragile ego attempted to process the correction, only to bounce off the wall of his inherent superiority complex. "I don't care about your technical gibberish, so just fix the machine and get my sparkling water before I report your insubordination to senior management." He spat back childishly. Rather than engaging in a pointless shouting match that would only feed his vanity, I offered a tight, artificial smile that carried all the warmth of an Arctic gale. "Right away, Julian, I will personally see to your hydration," I said quietly, turning on my heel as the heavy glass doors sealed behind me with a gentle pneumatic hiss. I didn't march to the executive kitchen. Instead, I took a direct detour into the primary maintenance access closet to open the localized environmental subpanel hidden behind the wiring conduits. Anger was a useless, volatile fuel that burned out too quickly, whereas absolute hatred was a cold energy source capable of powering a long-term tactical campaign. This entire complex was my living organism, and I knew every thermal pocket, structural flaw, and digital vulnerability lurking within its concrete walls. Julian made the fatal mistake of mistaking my silence for submission, completely oblivious to the fact that I held total control over the very atmosphere he was breathing. I pulled out my ruggedized field tablet and bypassed the basic user interface to bring up the localized climate controls for the executive suite. With 3 deliberate taps on the screen, I dropped the target temperature in the main conference room by 4 degrees and boosted the humidity exhaust sequence. It wasn't enough to trigger an automated system alarm, but it was more than sufficient to make his pristine silk shirt cling to his skin during his big presentation. After retrieving a single bottle of chilled mineral water from the secondary supply room, I slipped back into the boardroom with silent efficiency and set the glass on a coaster in front of him. Julian merely snatched the bottle without looking up, grunting a dismissive instruction for me to stand in the corner out of the frame while he adjusted his microphone. I retreated into the shadows near the egress route, knowing that the real work of dismantling his career was about to begin in the basement logs, rather than instantly reporting the incident to corporate HR where Julian's political allies could easily sweep it under the rug. I instructed Marcus to lock the raw footage into an immutable data vault. Enable level for activity logging on his credential ID, capturing every keystroke, door access, and automated request he generates from this second forward, I instructed. What's the end game here? Evelyn, Marcus asked, leaning back as his monitor flickered with real-time tracking data. He thinks he's untouchable because he promised the overseas board he would slash operational overhead by 30% before the quarter ends. I explained cold-heartedly, he plans to achieve those numbers by terminating our third-party maintenance crews, firing our custodial staff, and forcing cheap contractors into high-risk technical zones. I left the command center and boarded the freight lift, feeling the old steel cables strain as the cab began its slow, deliberate ascent toward the lower office floors. Rather than instantly reporting the incident to corporate HR where Julian's political allies could easily sweep it under the rug, I instructed Marcus to lock the raw footage into an immutable data vault. Enable level for activity logging on his credential ID, capturing every keystroke, door access, and automated request he generates from this second forward, I instructed. What's the end game here? Evelyn, Marcus asked, leaning back as his monitor flickered with real-time tracking data. He thinks he's untouchable because he promised the overseas board he would slash operational overhead by 30% before the quarter ends. I explained cold-heartedly. He plans to achieve those numbers by terminating our third-party maintenance crews, firing our custodial staff, and forcing cheap contractors into high-risk technical zones. I left the command center and boarded the freight lift, feeling the old steel cables strain as the cab began its slow, deliberate ascent toward the lower office floors. Stepping off onto the 8th floor, I was greeted by a depressing graveyard of dismantled cubicles, stacked computer monitors, and cleared filing cabinets. This floor had previously housed a brilliant nonprofit educational technology group that had spent 5 years designing open-source learning tools for underprivileged school districts. Now, the space smelled of industrial adhesive and damp drywall, ruined by sudden eviction notices posted on every glass partition. Clara, the lead director of the nonprofit, was standing near the emergency exit packing the remaining contents of her desk into a battered cardboard box. He gave us 3 business days to vacate the premises, Evelyn, Clara said softly, her eyes rimmed with red from hours of quiet frustration. He cited an emergency environmental hazard, claiming our sector contained dangerous airborne contaminants that required immediate isolation. Having personally certified the environmental safety logs for every square foot of this building for 15 years, I knew his claim was an absolute fabrication. There are no contaminants on this floor, Clara. I tested the duct insulation myself during last month's mandatory inspection, I stated firmly, my hands clenching into tight fists at my sides. He forged an environmental report so he could clear this prime square footage for an offshore crypto mining firm willing to pay triple market rent in unaudited cash. I realized with sickening clarity, Julian was not merely an arrogant executive with poor interpersonal skills. He was actively committing corporate fraud and sabotaging legitimate organizations to line his own pockets. I reached into my jacket, pulled